Um,
Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet in Highland Park, New Jersey, at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet. And joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky on Sheikh Chesed, New York City, Rabbi Barry J. Chesler with the light of the Lord beaming in on him in a new domicile, Mazel Tov, on
Thank you.
the transition. And we are recording this on day 622, Hayom. 622 Yom. Today is the 622nd day. Shem Shana Achat Shmona Chodashim Ve'Shnemasar Yamim B'Choshech. 1 year, 8 months, 12 days in darkness. Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will that our hostage families and hostages be pulled out of this darkness and be returned to their homes. Le'or Beitam, to the light of their homes. B'shalom uvivriyot, in peace and in health. Amen.
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 And look, we're recording this also on it's day 6, day 5 of this new war in Iran, and it looks like things are there are spectacular achievements for Israel, notwithstanding the fact that it's a war, and war brings with it all the apprehensions, and let's of course note with um, the malaise and the tension that Israelis face, and the barrage of missiles. It seems to be in decline, the number and the frequency, but over 24 individuals have lost their lives in Israel. Many, many hundreds are now without homes, and people close to us have to
No,
spend
one,
some time in shelters periodically throughout the day. Jeremy.
So
yeah,
I think the cautionary note that is important is that it's a great technical achievement for Israel, but it's way too early to assess the
No, of
political
course, and
ramifications.
and and that's where hope comes in. I don't know, Jeremy, you were going to comment also.
yeah. I mean, no, what Barry said is very correct. Israel has often. I mean, I was watching the Israeli news, and Tzachi Hanegbi, who's the what do you call it? He's the head of the
Head of the
National
National
Security
Security.
Cabinet. Um, was asked, and he didn't really have a very good answer. How is it possible that the IDF was so unbelievably successful tactically, operationally in Lebanon and in Iran, and so woefully, disastrously inept on October 7th? How can both of these things be true? And yet they are both true. And and Israel has just tremendous know-how and human capital and ingenuity and bravery and um, and they have tended to be much less good at knocking that up to a strategic or a diplomatic achievement as well. But I was starting to say about I was once fairly close to a terrorist bomb, the one in which my rabbinical school classmate Matt Eisenfeld was killed in 1996. And I heard it, it was so loud. And I wasn't that close, but it was really loud. And it turned out to be a dug up landmine. Somebody had taken a landmine and carried it onto a bus and detonated it and killed a bunch of people. And what just stuck with me, I mean, I remember in the Second Lebanon War hearing the distant cannons, and in this war and right after October 7th, I heard the cannons, when I was in the Gaza envelope near Gaza, and distant cannons. But the sound of that landmine was really
Very
quite
loud. Yeah.
powerful. And when you see the damage that a ballistic missile, I mean, Israelis have been under rocket fire from Gaza for all these many years, and it's terrible stuff. But when you see the damage that a ballistic missile fired from however many hundreds of miles away Iran is, and what it does to an apartment building, it's just mind-blowing.
It's mind blowing. Well, it's also apartment blowing. And so look, we are look, facing days of destiny, Yamim Machri'im, and I think we are in an epoch-making time. This we are in a very historical time, and we're living through it. Albeit as always, as we remark from thousands of miles away, lives are upended. Schedules upended. My daughter now is stranded, trying to make her way back to Israel. Many families are in this kind of state of suspension. I,
My daughter's in Israel
yeah,
trying
to get back. I have people on the
to
show also
actually
trying to get
she's not trying to get back so hard, but we're trying to get her back. And
exactly.
we do have a
So
ticket. We do have a ticket for her, but the ticket is for 2 weeks from now, and with the assumption that El Al will be flying. Obviously, El Al didn't make up the date that they sold that ticket. Presumably,
no,
they've been told by the government that this will happen. But a lot of stuff can still happen between now and then, so we'll see.
we will see. So, I mean, there's so many ways to segue into the Parsha. I'm just going to say it's a beautiful Parsha, an amazing Parsha.
An
Uh,
amazing Parsha.
Amazing Parsha. It's got the story at the beginning, um, and it's the story of the 12 scouts, which functions as a catastrophe, another catastrophe in the story of the Bible. Um, I'm so curious about one facet of the story. I have, there's so many things to talk about in the story. Shlach Lecha Anashim, send men. This is how it begins, and the text lists all the names of the men that had these tribal representatives and the function of their mission and their return. But I want to get your reactions to the idea, the charge that Moses gives them is Uritem et haaretz mahi, look at the land, see what it is. Chachazak hu harafeh, how strong, how weak, hamaat, imrav, many or not. Is it a good land? Is it a bad land? Are there cities? Are they fortresses? Are there trees? Is it a productive land? And then the final kind of coda to this is v'chazaktem, be strong, ulekachtem mipri haaretz, and take the fruit of the land. So I've been studying this question of the fruit of the land and thinking that the fruit, which is part of the way that we visually represent the story, with the two of the 12 holding a big cluster of grapes on a pole. And the Torah never says that. The Torah never says that it's a big cluster of grapes. It just says that they came back they went through the land, and in verse 23 it says, Vayichretu misham zmora. They cut, I guess, a piece of vine. Ve'eshkol anavim, a cluster of grapes. Echad, one cluster of grapes. Vayisauhu. They carry it. Bamot bishnayim, one a pole by two people. So the assumption is, why two people? Because it's big. But does it have to be big? And so I go into these different places in which I imagine, well, grapes perish, they're perishable food. How long would it take grapes how long would they last in the heat of the Middle Eastern sun? And the answer is not too long. And so would they be taken back as grapes or as raisins? Does it make a
So
difference?
I,
And what am I going after anyway?
I think the question you have to ask is when are they bringing the grapes back? I think that the simplest explanation is that when they're about to leave, that's when they get the grapes.
So
And then they return to the people because, you know, we have to assume that the author of the story, whether we think it's God or some human being, is familiar with the weather conditions in ancient Israel, and they're not writing a story that, on the face of it, could not make be made sensible. And so it could be that as they're about to leave the land, they're going to take the fruit. And the word that you emphasize, bit chazaktem, I think is there because in order to get the fruit, they have to get close to the people, right? Grapes are not grown far off from people; they're grown relatively close. When I was on kibbutz, we would go out to the vineyards to pick grapes.
right. So you're
Yeah.
seeing embedded in the story that the story has to make sense from its context, the
Yeah,
geography. It
and
ha it
content.
it has to make sense. in terms of the season, it's and the narrator of the story cleverly says to us, "Vayamim yemei bikurei anavim." It's they went during the time of the harvest of grapes, which is late summer, right?
Sometime after Shavuot.
Sometime after Shavuot. Okay, so we then this is not unusual in the Bible. To kind of place a moment in the context of something large. So the narrator, you're saying, has to know some basic realia relating to the land, which is the grapes are harvested here. This is what you're likely to see, and and it all has to make sense, that way. I don't know, Jeremy, what would your
Yeah, I think Barry's attempt is appealing, but the story also gives us geographic markers, and they are they are sent out. The spies are sent out Mimidbar Paran, which is like way down in the Negev, and Nahal Eshkol is, I think, by any you know
estimation?
any estimation, it's near Hebron.
It's about 150 miles, 200 miles away, right?
So even
That's a
even if
day's
what you
journey.
if even if what you said was correct, it doesn't mean that they had it with them carrying around the whole time. It means that they got it on the way out, so they would still be comparatively fresh. Uh, it's still a really long way to go. So I think that, I mean, I generally think that it's more fruitful uh, to just decide to bracket a bunch of details, to realize that what the Bible excels at is telling us stories freighted with symbolic meaning, and and not, more or less plausible accounts of how these events could have unfolded. So I'm more inclined to read. I hear what you're saying about, it doesn't exactly say that the reason that there were two people carrying the grape cluster is because it was so heavy. Maybe but I think that, and here I am just perhaps, influenced by the centuries of iconography here. But I do think that the Bible is, rather than telling a sort of a factual-ish story of where they went and what they saw, it's trying to tell us that they had access to almost unbelievably symbolically powerful fertility of the land, for fertility of the land symbol. You have this grape that is just not really in human scale. And by the way, when they go to the land, they see the Anakim and the Nephilim, they see giants. And so it's telling us a story that has a good deal of symbolic import apart from whatever kind of factual matrix.
This is why this Parsha talk is amazing, okay? Because here we are, we're three people, we all see three different things in the same text, okay, whether we read it literally, symbolically, or with a certain kind of trying to piece together logically what the story is. And I want to say, for our listeners and viewers who we so appreciate, this is what makes the Torah great. This is because the Torah unites us despite the fact or because of the fact that there are multiple ways to interpret it and multiple ways to draw meaning out of it, as we demonstrate on a weekly basis. So I would say, that the symbolism here is really important. I would just add the following before I want to just change tacks here, which is, part of the symbolism is the symbolism of Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, which I think a compelling interpretation of those words, the land flowing with milk and honey, is a wild land that is undeveloped, that can yield uh, its it can be a very, very generative place for pasture of flocks of sheep and goats, cattle, and also wildflowers and bees for honey. So that in the wildness of the land, the uncultivated state of this land, you bring your flocks and you produce milk from your flocks of goats and sheep, and the bees that roam and eat the pollen from the wildflowers of this land then produce their honey, and that is how you get a land zavat chalav udvash. And the word zav in certain contexts has other meaning, but in this context, flow, dripping,
Well, it's the
dripping.
same meaning.
It's the
It's the
same
same.
meaning, okay? So it's dripping with milk and honey, and we, because we have that, such iconography and such, Eretz Avachalav, the song and the dance and the hora, we think of that as the fruitful land, but in fact it represents a stage of the land that is, undeveloped. And the fruit, ulakachtem lachem pri eitz, that represents a higher stage in the development of the land so that there are orchards there are vineyards there, and people are developing them. And
So,
and this is what Moses is saying, go get me fruit of the land to show that there's development potential.
so it's interesting to me that the people that we would describe as wild and undeveloped are Ishmael and Esau. And perhaps what's going on here then is that the Israelites themselves are leaving this wild and undeveloped stage of their own lives and trying to become a settled people in the land and are having a hard time putting everything together because all they know is slavery and the memory of being shepherds. And they're being asked to do something incredibly difficult, which is to farm. And they're not so willing to go be on board with that.
Hmm.
They have to, they have to have their own desire for dignity. They are in the desert, they eat.
Well, I think Ishmael and Esau present themselves with dignity,
Uh-huh.
but I think that certainly the later commentary, even within the Bible, is that they're wild and undeveloped. Ishmael himself is described as a wild being.
Yeah.
Um, and what's striking to me is that the Israelites have to leave Ishmael and Esau behind in order to become Israelites.
So, I always like to to point out to people the postscript on Esav and Ishmael, by the way, that both of them get quite domesticated. Esav, especially, is reported in the last chapters of, where he appears. He has a couple of wives, he has lots of children, he settles in Seir. He's no longer the hunter that he's presented as. He actually lives a life that is accords with the family idea of the Bible, which I think is fascinating. That there is a transition in Asa from the hunter to the settled person. Ishmael also, although Ishmael is never described as a hunter. Okay, so
Well, he has a
He's a
bow,
yeah,
he
he'll
has
be
yeah, no,
bow
no,
yeah,
and
right,
he'll
arrow.
be a Rovek Kashat.
And I don't think
exactly.
he's doing that for sport.
Yeah,
All
he's
right.
not, it's not
So
archery.
let's
Wait,
pivot
before we leave honey for a second,
yeah,
I
go
just
ahead.
wanted to note that there are definitely passages, most obviously the story of Samson, where he takes honey out of the. Talk about things that seem to have a symbolic meaning. Samson sees a
Lion.
lion's carcass that has in which bees have nested, and he takes the honey out of that carcass,
And he eats it.
and
He stuffs his face with it. Yeah.
stuffs his face with it, and that's clearly a bee honey. What you just said about the wildflowers and the bees suggests that these places may also connote bee honey. There's a story where Jonathan, Saul's son, uh,
Eldest.
it's a little bit of a complicated story because there's a fast day going on and he's unaware of it, but he gathers all his troops and they find honey in a forest, and it seems like that is also bee honey. But very often we seem to talk about fruit honey, some sort of, and maybe Elliot, maybe this relates to what you were talking about, the methods by which ancient people could have accessed stuff. They may have made date syrup or fig syrup like our Ceylon, something like that. But this calls to mind to me a little bit crossing the metaphors, not the same about Zavat Chalavu Devash, the land dripping with milk and honey. There's an awesome passage I'm just going to read it to you now from Tractate Ketubot, a very, almost sensuously alive in this long passage about the greatness of Eretz Yisrael. Rami Bar Yechezkel, Ikla B'nai Brak, he happened to come to B'nai Brak, and there he saw Chazan Hulahanhu Ize, de Achlan Tute Te'ene, v'kanatev dusha mitene v'chalba tayaf minayu. He sees these goats, and the goats are eating uh, beneath a fig tree, and the fig tree is oozing honey, and milk is dripping from the udders of the goats, and the two liquids flow together. The milk from the goats' bodies, this oozing sweet syrup from the fig tree, and he says, Ume'ara b'hadei hadare, and the two substances mixed together. Amar hainu zavat chalavu dvash.
Sure.
This is the dream of land flowing with milk and honey, and I just think that that's a on a imaginative, poetic, literary level, such a great scene. And
Absolutely. I have to give us the page number of that.
yeah, 111b,
On Masechet
Subot.
Ketubot. Okay, so that's a perfect example of how you take a phrase and it can mean one thing in one context and can mean something totally different in another context. And what's the term for this? This is betrayal, not betrayal, creative betrayal. David Roski's. Okay, so I want to. I mean, and fascinating example of Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash. The story is the crisis story in the desert. From the story, they get, um, the sentence of 40 years of wandering. And I was focused on the fruit because it occurs to me that the fruit, in the symbolic reading of it, the fruit represents something about rejection. That the people, they see it, they're shown the fruit, um, and they reject. They're swayed by the spies, the scouts report that's not related to the fruit, but it's related to the population of the land and their fear that they won't be able to conquer the land. So I want to pose this for you and get your reaction to this. First of all, thinking about their rejection and how this rejection compares to the egel, the golden calf. And second, I want to propose that the Bikurim ritual, which is articulated in chapter 23, 4 of
Okay.
Devarim,
26.
26 of Devarim, Kitavo, where the pilgrim to Jerusalem brings first fruits and recites a very long passage in which he says, I'm grateful. I'm grateful. You brought, the historical thing, you took us out of Egypt, da da da, you brought us to the land, and here I bring you this fruit. And it's an expression of gratitude. So the expression of gratitude of the Bikurim ritual functions as a repair of the resentment or the rejection of the gift of the land. And that what is going on an annual basis is liturgical repair or an annual attempt to repair the great breach that was done in rejecting God's gift. God was offended by it, and rightly so, as many would be offended in the rejection of a gift. And that this functions as a counterpoint or as a complement, so to speak, of the other sin of rejection, which is the golden calf. The golden calf is a rejection of God as God through the substitution of a concrete object for God. And this is a rejection of the land. And both create the possibilities for repair. In the golden calf, it's the Yom Kippur, and for the scouts, it's the ritual of Bikurim. I don't know how you respond to that.
Very nice. Very nice. And the presentation of fruits. I mean, the way, you observed as we were talking beforehand about the way the word pre functions poetically in the story, and it's very, it takes a lot of emphasis. It's like musically, if you could imagine, you know, a note right on the word every time the word fruit appears. But I want to throw in maybe one more example in the Bible in general. Like these symbolic stories. Is the fruit in the Garden of Eden have anything to do with this?
Well,
Like,
I asked myself that question also, and there may be something there. I can't really, link it all together. And the other pre that I think is important is pre Eitz Hadar, right? The fruit of goodly trees, which I love the interpretation of the four species as they're four representations of different kinds of water sources in Israel. So it's the it's avot, right? The hadas, which is on the on streams and brooks,
No,
the
the
uh,
Hadassah is on the mountains.
mountains,
The Nachal, the Arvei Nachal is on the brooks.
Arbenachal by the river.
Yeah.
Okay,
And what
and
about the etrog? Is
the
that irrigation?
Had pre-Eitz
is
Hadar,
is
Hadar al
highly
Hamayim.
cultivated, hydro.
Yeah.
It's a lot of
Yeah.
water needs. So what and so we have hadas, arava, and the lulav, which is a desert oasis.
So I want
The-
to come back to your interpretation.
yeah.
What I find fascinating is that this liturgy of repair, as you call it, is to repair for sin. And I think it masks a better understanding of the people. And in both stories, what motivates the people is fear, and they're scared. And we have an image of a scared person in Sefer Dvarim. When people are summoned to go to war, the one who is fearful of heart is excused from battle. And rather than see that as a sin, I think it's something that we have to wrestle with. Certainly, in your description of the times that we're currently living in, there's a lot of fear in the world because we're uncertain as to how events are going to unfold. And what I find intriguing in your interpretation, Elliot, is that are we better off looking at our ancestors as having sinned in these two episodes, the golden calf and the spies, or better thinking of them as just scared and incapable of making good decisions? And what is important, I think, about the liturgy of sin is that sin, which we think of as being volitional most of the time, gives us an avenue forward because if we recognize that we have sinned, then we can take control of our lives. It's very difficult to do anything with fear other than be afraid.
So I
I,
would go the same direction as you. I'm almost trying to visualize this in a chart and put these categories next to each other in a chart, which is fear and courage versus sin and repair or repentance, and that one could generate courage in a context of educating, in a context of building up your capabilities, etc. And the result of courage to overcome fear, I think, is the capability of doing things. What's worse, to lack courage, to live in fear, or to feel that you're always going to feel unforgiven. Uh, and
I feel like
yeah,
I would want to just add to this conversation that courage is actually in sort of classical classical ethics, it's considered a virtue, and so there is something defective of the character that is too frightened. So in Hilchot Deot, Maimonides is talking about the proper character traits, and he says in almost everything, not everything. There's a couple of exceptions, but in almost everything, you need to go for the golden mean. You need to go to the Shvil Hazahab between two extremes. Uh, too much fearfulness makes you a coward, and then you can't stand up to do the right thing, and you can't weather life's challenges. And so, too much fear is a problem, but too little fear is a problem because then you'll be a foolhardy person, and you'll risk your life, and you won't take care of yourself. So, in the middle of cowardliness and whatever the way opposite was, foolhardiness, lies courage. And so, I think that these stories, both of these stories that we're talking about, the golden calf uh, is more religiously complicated. The spy story is probably a little bit religiously more simple. To be God's servant, to build this society, to have left Egypt, to go to the land of Israel, and to build, a holy society, and to take on the breed of your ancestors, that's going to require some courage. And so, if you just look at yourself and say, "I'm a grasshopper," these people are gigantic. They're gonna whomp up on me. that is a moral failing.
Interesting.
Well,
Yeah,
the moral failing wasn't saying I'm a grasshopper. It was saying that the natives saw us as grasshoppers.
sure. I would not want to choose between the feeling of unforgiven and the feeling of fear. It's hard to even think about these. They're very, very difficult, both emotionally and just in the course of your life. I want to just end with this part of the converse this question on how the calendar in traditional Judaism, rabbinic Judaism, associates certain dates with both of those events, the golden calf and the spies. And Barry, I want to turn to you because you have this a handle on it. Talk about these two events as pivotal events on the calendar, and how the calendar expresses it.
So in Mishnah Tanit, the rabbis frame the 3 weeks, which begin on the 17th of Tammuz and culminate with the 9th of Av, with a series of events which they imagine, for lack of a better word, to occur. There are 5 events associated with the 17th of Tammuz and 5 events associated with Tisha B'Av. And the first one on each list is a biblical event. For the 17th of Tammuz, that is associated with the sin of the golden calf. Moses came down on the 17th of Tammuz and broke the Luchot. And Tisha B'Av is the sin of the spies, where the people are condemned to wander in the wilderness for their failure to appreciate the bounty of the land that they were supposed to go and conquer, and instead they kind of withdrew from the divine. And it's an intriguing way to organize time because we have these 2 dark days, which bracket a 3 week period of introspection about national failure, which I think is always good to have in mind when we are thinking about ourselves as belonging to nations that, by the nature of their being, have failings and gives us a way to reckon with them.
It's fascinating how the Jewish history and the tradition condenses around these dates, a whole set of layered, calamities on both of them, and that I think that speaks to a human impulse, which is we are associative in these things, and of course, if we were to commemorate each day of the year as is, I have a like there are websites you can go to for, today's so and so's your site, today is this, and there's no end to what you can commemorate. I have a book of, the Holocaust, each day, right? So, you can look at the history of the Holocaust and you go like, this day, the Warsaw Ghetto, this day, they crushed this, that, and it becomes too much. And so you do need a day to condense all of these things. And it's interesting how the calendar does that. And, we're in a constant dialogue with these events, certainly because they are invoked uh, in the repentance to tshuva liturgy, the tshuva liturgy of Yom Kippur, and the daily tshuva liturgy of Tachanun. Because it's not that we're always repenting for these things, but in our lives, there are always echoes of these things. And at the core, they're rejections, the rejection of God as God and rejection of God's gift. And I guess, the simple sermon to end with is don't, don't reject it. Don't be a rejecter.
We'll take it. We'll
Yeah.
take it.
We'll take it. So listen, so here we are, feeling this sense of connection to each other, of course, to Klal Yisrael, in momentous days, historic days, epical days. We hope they remain epical, and of course, we know the experience that many are going through with loss, with suffering, longing,
And
also,
with uncertainty.
and with
Let's not forget
uncertainty.
that.
And let's not forget that. So praying for strength, praying for hope, and praying that the epical moment that we are in will be resolved swiftly. We wish everyone a beautiful Shabbat, and we will
Shabbat
see you
Shalom.
all next week on the next edition of Parsha Talk. Bye bye. Shabbat Shalom.